Fog rolls low across 60 acres of West Virginia pasture, the kind that swallows sound before it reaches the ridge. A gravel road cuts through it. Somewhere in that gray, an engine grinds down a gear. The truck comes into view. A flatbed hydraulics groaning backing toward a tree line nobody has walked in years. Chains rattle loose. Something heavy slides. The ground shudders when it lands. Oak, walnut, maple the size of kitchen tables. Hundreds of them already scattered across a field that once grew hay. 50 yards away, a woman stands at a broken gate. She does not move. She does not call out. In one hand, a tape measure. In the other, a notepad. The truck pulls away. The dust settles. She walks out into the ruin. She kneels beside the largest stump, runs her palm across the rings, and smiles. Every Thursday morning, just after 7, the logging trucks came rumbling down the gravel county road toward the back 40 of an abandoned farm outside a small town in the West Virginia foothills. The gate had been broken for years. Nobody bothered to fix it. The drivers backed their trailers up to the tree line hydraulics groaning against the cold morning air and let the stumps roll off into the weeds like they were dumping the leftovers of some larger meal nobody wanted to name. Oak stumps the size of kitchen tables. Maple stumps still weeping sap into the wet grass. A 4-foot walnut stump so heavy it cracked the ground when it landed, sending a shudder through the soil that a woman standing 40 yards away could feel through the soles of her boots. Most people would have called the sheriff. Most people would have called a lawyer. The woman at the edge of the field did neither. She watched the truck pull away in a cloud of diesel smoke. Then once the dust had settled and the sound of the engine had faded past the ridge, she walked out into the field with a notepad in one hand and a tape measure in the other. She knelt beside the biggest stump, ran her palm across the rings, counted them under her breath, wrote something down, moved to the next one. She did this every single week. Why wasn't she angry? Why hadn't she called anyone? Why was she measuring garbage that a logging company didn't even want? And why, when she finally straightened up and looked out over a field littered with hundreds of dead tree stumps, did she smile the way a person smiles when they're looking at something valuable? Her name was Nora Bracken, though anyone who'd known her more than a week called her Nora. Within 3 years, this field would produce her very first sale. Within 7, it would become the foundation of a business that changed everything for her, for this town, for a logging company that had no idea what it was really leaving behind. If stories about ordinary people turning life's biggest setbacks into something extraordinary speak to you, stay a while. There's more to this one than a field full of stumps. 2 years earlier, Nora Bracken had a different life entirely. She had a house with a wraparound porch in a subdivision 40 minutes from here, a husband named Richard who managed a regional sales territory for a farm equipment distributor, a calendar full of the small ceremonies of a life that looked from the outside like success. Neighborhood barbecues on Memorial Day, a leased SUV traded in every 3 years, a kitchen renovated twice because the first renovation was never quite right, then a second time because Richard read an article about resale values and decided the countertops needed to be a different shade of gray. She was 45 years old. She had spent 19 of those years building that life, one careful decision at a time, the way people build things they've been told they're supposed to want. She had spent the last 3 of those years slowly realizing it was hollow. And the year before that, just beginning to admit it to herself at 3 in the morning, standing in a kitchen that no longer felt like hers, drinking cold coffee she hadn't wanted in the first place. The divorce wasn't loud. There was no screaming, no thrown dishes, no scene at a restaurant that neighbors would repeat for years. There were just 2 lawyers across a mahogany conference table dividing 20 years into columns. Richard kept the house. Richard kept the boat. Richard kept most of the retirement account because his lawyer was better than hers, because his lawyer had gone to school with the judge, because Nora, frankly, was tired of fighting for things that had stopped feeling like they belonged to her, somewhere around the second kitchen renovation. What she kept was 60 acres of overgrown pasture and second-growth timber that had belonged to her father, a farm she hadn't set foot on since his funeral 11 years before. Her friends told her to fight harder. Her sister called from Ohio and said she was getting robbed blind. Nora signed the papers anyway, packed what fit into her sedan, and drove out to the only piece of property left with her name on the deed. A piece of land she remembered mostly as a smell wet leaves and wood smoke, and the particular dampness of a creek that ran along the western fence. She expected weeds. She expected a leaning barn and a farmhouse with a collapsed porch roof. She got all of that. The kitchen sink was full of the papery skeletons of dead wasps. The pantry door hung by one hinge. A family of raccoons had made a nest in what had once been her childhood bedroom, and the smell of it hit her the moment she pushed open the door, sharp and animal and old. She did not expect the stumps. The morning she found them, fog was still sitting low over the pasture, and the air smelled like fresh-cut wood mixed with damp earth and diesel exhaust that hadn't quite cleared yet. Sawdust clung to the wet grass and drifts gold against the green, catching the early light like something spilled from a bag. Somewhere back in the tree line, she could still hear the last truck grinding its way out onto the county road, the distinctive whine of a diesel engine climbing through gears. She stood at the broken gate for a long time before she moved one hand, resting flat against the top rail, feeling the cold metal under her palm before she understood what she was actually looking at. The stump started maybe 200 yards past the old fence line where the woods opened into what used to be her father's back pasture. Dozens of them at first glance. Then as she walked further, she realized it was hundreds. Massive hardwood stumps, some freshly cut and still weeping resin, others gray and weathered from sitting for years through freezes and thaws. Oak, walnut, maple, cherry, ash. Some were small enough to lift with two people. Others were wider than the dining room table she'd left behind in the subdivision 4 feet across, with root systems still clinging to clumps of dirt like fists that hadn't yet decided to let go. Nora walked among them the way a person walks through a cemetery she doesn't recognize. She counted 40 before she stopped counting. Her boots sank into ground churned up by tire tracks. A crow watched her from a low branch, then lifted off without making a sound. She learned from a neighbor, an older man named Harlan Whitfield, who'd farmed the adjoining property her whole life, that a logging company had been harvesting timber from a large tract 2 properties over for the better part of a decade. Nobody had lived on the Bracken place since her father passed. The gate stayed broken. Nobody complained. So the crew started hauling their stumps here instead of paying for proper disposal because it was easier, because it was free, because an empty field doesn't call anyone to stop it. Everybody just got used to it, Harlan told her, leaning against his pickup with a thumb hooked in the pocket of his overalls. Figured somebody would eventually say something. Nobody ever did. He was 70 if he was a day. His face had the deep, sun-cured lines of a man who had spent more of his life outdoors than in. He looked at Nora with eyes that had watched 3 generations of Brackens come and go, and he said what he said without judgment, which was almost worse than judgment would have been. Nora had every right to be furious. For about a week she was. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning and lie in the dark listening to the house settle, running through the arithmetic of what had been taken from her first by Richard, then by strangers in hard hats she'd never met. She'd walk out to the field before dawn and stand there in the cold breath fogging in front of her, feeling something hot and useless building in her chest. And she'd think about calling the sheriff, and then she'd think about what the sheriff would actually do, and then she'd go back inside and make coffee. She couldn't taste. She drove into town on the 8th day and sat across from a lawyer named Marion Delacroix, who told her within the first 10 minutes that she had an unusually strong case. Trespass, illegal dumping, years of unauthorized use of private property. A settlement or a court order could be substantial. Marion was younger than Nora had expected, mid-30s maybe. With a pen, she kept clicking against the edge of a legal pad in a rhythm that betrayed the caffeine in her system. Her office smelled like new carpet and old paper. On the wall behind her hung a framed law degree from a university Nora had never heard of, and a photograph of a golden retriever that had, according to a small brass plaque underneath, been named Barrister. "So what happens to the stumps if I win?" Nora asked. Marion looked up from the legal pad. "They'll be required to remove every one of them. Full cleanup, all at their cost." Nora nodded slowly. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, driving home that evening past mile after mile of cleared timberland and empty pasture, past the sagging billboards for auction houses and feed stores, a strange thought kept circling back on her. What if they were worth more here than gone? It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't even a real idea yet. It was just a question, the kind that keeps you awake at 11 at night for no good reason, the kind that follows you into the shower the next morning and won't be rinsed off. She didn't know anything about wood at that point beyond what she'd absorbed helping her father split firewood as a girl. She didn't know the difference between air drying and kiln drying, didn't know what checking meant when applied to a piece of lumber, didn't own a chainsaw. But she couldn't stop thinking about the walnut stump, the one with grains so dense and dark, it looked almost black in the shade, swirling in patterns that no two stumps seemed to share. like each one carried its own signature. No one had ever bothered to read. That night, unable to sleep, she went out to the barn with a flashlight. The place was a wreck. Rotted hay in the corners, a possum that hissed at her from the loft, a coil of baling wire that grabbed the cuff of her jeans as she stepped over it. But at the back against the far wall stood something she remembered from childhood, a wooden cabinet with an iron latch that her father had built himself and kept locked for reasons he'd never explained. She'd asked him about it once when she was 9. He'd been kneeling beside a piece of oak, running his thumb along a grain line, and he'd looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Someday," he said. "Not today." She'd forgotten about the cabinet entirely until this moment. She'd forgotten a lot of things about her father. She was beginning to realize, in the 11 years since his funeral, in the 20 years before that, of pretending her life in the subdivision was the one she'd been building toward. She stood in front of the cabinet now with the flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand, and she thought about how strange it was to feel closer to a dead man in a rotting barn than she had felt to her living husband across a conference table. The latch was rusted shut. She had to go back to the truck for a hammer. Inside the cabinet, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone yellow with age, she found 3 things. A set of hand chisels older than she was, the handles worn smooth by grip. A small leather-bound notebook, the pages soft and warped from years of humidity. And tucked underneath, both a folded piece of paper with her name written on the outside. In her father's handwriting, the letters careful and slightly slanted, the way he had written when he wanted to be sure something was understood. She sat down on the barn floor. She didn't open the paper yet. She opened the notebook first. The first page was dated the summer she'd left for college. Her father had been 53 then. The entry was short. 3 walnut trees came down on the Halloran track today. They will bring the stumps here by month's end. He does not know that I know. It is not my land to police. But I will watch what they leave. She turned the page. The next entry was 2 months later. First stump measured, 41 inches at the widest point. 29 rings visible on the exposed face, though the heartwood is difficult to read where the chainsaw has torn it. This tree was standing when my grandfather cleared the eastern pasture. It saw more of this country than I have. The next entry, the one after that, page after page, her father had been recording every stump. He had been walking out to this field week after week for years, measuring, sketching, identifying species by bark and grain, noting the ones with unusual coloration or figure. He had been keeping a private inventory of a crime nobody knew he had witnessed. Nora sat on the barn floor for a long time. The flashlight dimmed, and she shook it back to life. Somewhere outside, an owl called twice and then went quiet. Her father, who had never once in his life run a business, who had worked a paper mill in Ohio 5 days a week for 31 years to keep the family afloat, who had come home every Friday night smelling of chemicals and cheap coffee, had spent the last decade of his life quietly and methodically studying a field full of wood he did not own and could not legally touch. He had loved something he had never once told her about. He had loved it the way people love a thing they have decided they will not act on because acting on it would cost more than they could afford. She opened the folded paper last. It was short. If you are reading this, I did not get around to what I meant to. Learn the wood before you love it. Everything else follows. She read it 3 times. She folded it carefully back along the creases her father had made. She put it in her shirt pocket over her heart, not because she was being sentimental, but because she did not yet trust herself to put it anywhere she might lose it. Then she walked out of the barn and stood in the field in the dark, and she looked at the stumps the way she had never looked at them before, which was to say the way her father had looked at them. The next morning, she drove back to Marion Delacroix's office without an appointment. She sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes reading a magazine about horse breeding she did not care about. And when Marion finally came out and raised an eyebrow, Nora stood up and said the words she had rehearsed on the drive. "I'm not filing." Marion led her into the office and closed the door. She sat down across the desk and looked at Nora for a long moment before she spoke. "You understand what you're walking away from. I understand. You have documentation if you'd let me put it together. Years of it. Photographs of the site alone would be enough to get their attention. I understand." Marion tapped the pen against the legal pad. She was choosing her words carefully. Nora could see her doing it. "Is this a religious thing?" Nora almost laughed. "No. Is somebody pressuring you?" "No." Marion set the pen down. "Then can I ask what you're doing?" Nora thought about it. She had thought about it all the way here, and she still didn't have a clean answer, which was itself a kind of answer. I don't know yet, she said, but I've been asking the wrong question. Everybody's been telling me to ask what those stumps cost me. I want to know what they're worth. Marion looked at her the way a person looks at someone she has decided she doesn't fully understand, but has to respect anyway. She nodded once. She said, if you change your mind, the door's open. She did not ask again. Nora walked out of the office and stood on the sidewalk in the town's small square, and she watched a boy on a bicycle throw a folded newspaper up onto a porch across the street. And she thought about her father coming home Friday nights with the paper mill on his clothes, and she thought about the 29 rings on the first stump he had measured, and she thought for the first time since Richard had handed her the initial divorce papers 8 months ago that she had chosen something rather than had it chosen for her. She spent the next 3 weeks doing almost nothing but reading. The internet at the farmhouse wasn't hooked up, so she drove to the public library in town every morning and stayed until it closed. The librarian, a woman with gray braids named Coraline, started leaving books on the front desk for her without being asked. Books about hardwood identification. Books about kiln drying. A slim, self-published pamphlet from the 1980s about traditional Appalachian woodworking that Nora would later say taught her more than anything else in that library. She learned that hardwood species carried wildly different value and character. That walnut was prized for furniture and deepened into a rich chocolate brown with subtle violet undertones once it was oiled. That oak's tight grain made it durable for outdoor pieces, but demanded patience during drying because rushed oak would split along the ray plane and ruin months of work. That maple often hid a subtle curl or spalting pattern invisible until the wood was cut and finished a hidden signature you couldn't predict from the outside. She learned that a stump had to lose most of its internal moisture before it could be worked without cracking apart later, and that green wood cut too soon would check and split as it dried, sometimes violently. She learned that the process took months, not days, sometimes years for the larger pieces. Her father's notebook, which she now read every night before bed, had entries about drying times for specific species that matched almost word for word what she was finding in books published by universities. He had figured all of it out, alone. In a paper mill town in Ohio at the end of a shift with a pencil and a library card and a piece of land 2 states away he never stopped thinking about. The first hitch came 4 weeks in. She was walking the field on a Tuesday morning, the sky low and pewter over the ridge, when she heard tires on gravel behind her. She turned around expecting Harlan. It wasn't Harlan. Richard's SUV, the new one he'd traded up to during the settlement, was rolling down her driveway. She hadn't seen him in 2 months. She had told herself she was fine with that. Standing in the field now, watching the vehicle come to a stop by the farmhouse and the driver's door swing open, she realized she was less fine than she had wanted to be. He looked exactly the same. Pressed jeans, the kind of shirt that cost 3 times what it should, a haircut so recent it still had comb lines in it. He raised a hand in a wave that pretended to be casual. Nora walked toward him because standing still felt worse. He looked past her at the field. He looked back at her. "You've got yourself a project," he said. "I've got myself a life, Richard. What are you doing here?" He put both hands in his pockets. He rocked back on his heels. He was working up to something, and he wasn't good at it, which was one of the things she had once loved about him and had grown to hate. "I've been thinking about the settlement," he said, "about whether we were fair to each other." Nora waited. "There's a friend of mine, he went on a guy I've known since Rotary, does some brokering out of Charleston. He mentioned there might be a buyer interested in this parcel, someone looking to expand a commercial operation nearby. Good number. Better than what we appraised it at in the divorce." He said it too smoothly. He'd practiced it in the car. Nora looked at the field, then back at him. How much better? He named a figure. It was almost double the appraisal. She watched his face while he said it, and she watched him watch her face for a reaction, and she felt something cold settle behind her sternum, a hard, clean recognition that she had not felt in years, because for years she had made herself unable to feel it. "Who's the buyer, Richard?" He smiled the smile that had once worked on her. "I don't know all the details. My guy's just the middleman." That night after Richard had left, after she had told him she'd think about it, in the tone of voice she had learned to use with him toward the end of the marriage, the tone that meant no but bought her time, she drove back into town and sat in Marion Delacroix's office for the 3rd time in a month. Marion listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Marion pulled a legal pad toward her and started writing down names. "Give me 48 hours," she said. Marion called back in 36. The middleman Richard had mentioned wasn't just some Rotary friend. He was a broker whose only listed client for the past 2 fiscal years had been a subsidiary of the same logging company that had been dumping stumps on Nora's field for the better part of a decade. They wanted her land. They wanted it because their current operation had been cited by the state twice in 3 years for improper disposal. And buying her 60 acres outright would let them convert an illegal dump into a legal staging yard with a paper trail that started clean. And Richard, Marion said carefully, had signed a non-binding letter of intent with the broker 4 months before the divorce was finalized. 4 months before he had sat across the mahogany table and let his lawyer argue that the Bracken parcel was a low-value inheritance not worth fighting over. He had known. He had known about the stumps. He had known what the company wanted, and he had structured the settlement to leave her holding a piece of land he intended to buy back through a shell arrangement at a fraction of what he could then flip it for. The only reason he was here now, offering her a number better than appraisal, was that the company had gotten impatient and put pressure on him to close. Nora sat in Marion's office, holding the phone against her ear long after Marion had stopped speaking. Through the window, she could see the boy on the bicycle from 3 weeks ago, or maybe a different boy, it didn't matter, throwing folded newspapers onto porches in the last of the afternoon light. "I want to know something," she finally said. "If I refuse to sell, if I hold on to this land and do what I'm thinking of doing with it, what happens to Richard?" Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she said honestly, "I think he loses everything. His numbers on the corporate side aren't good. He was counting on this deal." Nora nodded, though Marion couldn't see her. "Then he loses everything," she said. She drove home the long way that night, past fields she remembered from childhood, past the crossroads where her father had once stopped the truck to let a snapping turtle finish crossing the road. She did not feel triumphant. She felt older than she had that morning. She felt like a woman who had just discovered that the past 19 years of her life had been building toward this specific moment, and that the building had been done by hands other than her own, and that she was going to have to spend whatever came next unbuilding it and building something else in its place alone with no map. When she got home, she walked out to the field one more time. The moon was up 3/4 full, and the stumps threw long, low shadows across the pasture. She walked to the biggest one, the 4-foot walnut, and she knelt beside it and put her palm on the flat-cut face, the way she had that first morning, and she said quietly out loud to no one, and to her father, and to herself, "All right, show me." The next morning at the hardware store in town, she bought a moisture meter, a spiral-bound notebook with a hard cover to match the softer one from her father's cabinet, a pair of leather work gloves, and a small book on chainsaw safety that she read cover to cover in the parking lot before she started the truck. She stopped by the library on the way home and returned 3 books. Coraline had 2 more waiting for her without being asked. She did not yet know that within a week she would ruin her first stump. She did not know that within a month she would nearly quit. She did not know that a man named Otis Kettering, who had spent 31 years carving black bears and trailhead signs for the state park system before he retired to a small property at the edge of town, was already aware of her arrival on the Bracken place, because Harlan Whitfield had a habit of mentioning things at the diner on Sunday mornings, and Otis Kettering had a habit of listening more carefully than people realized. She did not know that Otis had known her father. She did not know that on a cold March afternoon 11 years earlier, 3 weeks before her father died, the 2 men had stood together at the edge of the same field, and her father had said something to Otis that Otis had been carrying quietly ever since, waiting for the day it might mean something. She only knew that night, sitting on the porch with her father's notebook open on her knee and a bowl of soup gone cold beside her, that she had chosen. That the choosing itself was the first real thing she had done in a decade. That the stumps were not going anywhere, and neither for the first time since she'd left the subdivision was she. The wind came up out of the west the way it always did before a rain in this part of the state, and it carried the smell of the field to her wet oak and old cherry, and the faint diesel undertone that would not fully leave the property for another year. She breathed it in. She wrote one line in the new notebook in handwriting that she was surprised to notice looked almost exactly like her father's, careful and slightly slanted, the way a person writes when they want to be sure something is understood. Day 1. Learn the wood before you love it. She closed the notebook. She went inside. Somewhere out past the tree line, an owl called twice and then went quiet. and Nora Bracken, 45 years old, freshly divorced custodian of 60 acres of ruined pasture and hundreds of stumps a logging company had thrown away, went to bed in a house that was finally, for the first time since she had arrived, beginning to feel like it might one day be hers. The first stump she ruined was a red oak 38 inches across, the color of dried blood along the outer rings and pale as bone in the heart. She had chosen it because it was closest to the barn and because from a distance it looked simple. She would learn over the next 6 hours that nothing about oak was simple, and that the word closest was doing a great deal of work in her decision-making that morning. Harlan Whitfield loaned her the chainsaw. He would not at first let her take it. She had walked over to his place at 7 in the morning. Coffee cup still in hand, wearing sneakers and a flannel shirt she had bought 15 years ago for a camping trip Richard had canceled at the last minute. Harlan opened the door, looked at her feet, looked at her face, closed the door again, and returned 3 minutes later with a pair of steel-toed boots that had belonged to his late wife. Betty was about your size, he offered. She would want somebody to get some use out of them. Nora tried to refuse. Harlan simply held the boots in front of her until she took them. He also produced a pair of cut-resistant chaps, a helmet with a mesh face shield, and a set of leather gauntlets stiff enough to stand on their own. Only then did he hand over the saw in orange steel that had seen enough seasons that its plastic housing was scratch pale in a dozen places. You cut with the bottom of the bar, he told her. Top of the bar kicks back. Kick back puts the tip in your face. Nothing else you learn today matters more than that. She nodded. She thought she understood. She would find out by 9:30 that morning that she did not. The first hour went adequately. She made shallow test cuts along the top of the oak, listening to the note of the engine change as the chain bit into wood. Sawdust flew up in a fine spray that clung to her sleeves. The saw was heavier than she had expected. Her forearms began to burn by minute 20. She rested. She started again. She had a plan she had drawn out the night before on graph paper, hollowing the center of the stump into a shallow bowl, the way one of the library books had shown a planter deep enough for perennials, wide enough to hold a small shrub. The plan collided with the wood at approximately 9:18. The bar bound in a cut she had opened too narrowly. When she pulled to free it, the chain came off the sprocket. She spent 40 minutes wrestling it back on, with her fingers going numb from the cold dropping tools in the wet grass, once knocking her helmet off her own head as she reached for a wrench. By 11, she had the saw running again. By noon, she had made 3 cuts that all met at the wrong angles, opening a hole in the middle of the stump that looked less like a planter and more like something that had happened to the oak while it was sleeping. By 2 in the afternoon, her palms had split open under the gloves, and the gloves were dark with what she initially thought was sap. She kept going. The wood in response kept refusing her. Where she wanted a clean scallop, the grain tore instead, ripping upward in long splinters that came away in her hand. Where she tried to smooth an edge, the chain wandered. She did not know that she was working against the grain instead of with it, because she did not yet understand that a stump had a grain to work with in the first place, that its rings and rays were a set of instructions she had been ignoring since the moment she pulled the starter cord. At 4:30, she shut the saw off and sat down in the dirt beside what she had done. She looked at the oak. The oak, mangled and torn along every surface she had touched, looked back at her with the patient indifference of something that had grown for 80 years before she got to it and had not asked to be improved. She cried briefly and without much sound. She wiped her face with a sleeve that left dirt across her cheek. Then she stood up, walked to the barn, put the saw down on the workbench, and did not touch it again for a week. The second stump she ruined was a maple. She rushed it. She knew cognitively that she was rushing it. She had read every warning about greenwood. She had her father's notebook open on the porch railing that same morning, and one of the entries she had read the night before said explicitly in his careful hand, "Maple pulled from a fresh cut will move for 2 full seasons. Do not seal it while it is still deciding what shape it wants to be." She sealed it anyway. She was tired of failing. She had been reading for weeks. She was going to make something, and she was going to make it now, and she picked a smaller maple stump from the pile near the tree line, one she remembered watching the trucks drop the previous fall, and she carved a rough bowl into the top face with the saw and a set of gouges she had ordered online with money she should have been putting toward propane. She coated the interior with an exterior polyurethane the hardware store clerk had promised would hold up to weather. She set it under the leaking overhang of the barn to cure. She went to bed pleased with herself for the first time in weeks. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday night at 11:40, she woke up to a sound like a rifle shot. She sat straight up in bed, heart hammering in a way she had not felt since a summer thunderstorm when she was 10 years old. She pulled on jeans and her father's old barn coat. She went out with a flashlight. The maple had split from lip to base. The crack ran through her carved bowl, through the sealed surface she had been so proud of, all the way down into the root flare, opening the stump like a piece of fruit that had gone wrong. The polyurethane had trapped the moisture inside instead of letting it out. The wood, still full of water it had not been allowed to release, had done what wood does when it is pushed past its patience. She stood there with the flashlight on the ruin, and she did not cry this time. She was too tired to cry. She just looked at what she had done and thought quite clearly that she did not know if she could keep doing this. She thought about calling her sister in Ohio. She thought about the number Marion Delacroix had quoted her 3 months ago as the likely settlement value of a trespass case. She thought about a heated apartment in some small city with a job at a desk and never ever having to make anything with her hands again. She thought about her father's line, "Learn the wood before you love it." She thought that she had loved it before she had learned it, and this was what love in the wrong order did. The next morning, Harlan came by to return a socket wrench he had borrowed years ago from her father and had never gotten around to bringing back. He looked at the split maple without comment. He looked at Nora's hands, which were still bandaged from the oak. "You need Otis," he said. "Otis who?" "Kettering. Lives out past the four-way on the county road. Used to carve for the state parks. Retired now. Doesn't take company as a rule." Nora shook her head. "I've been reading. I'll figure it out." Harlan nodded slowly, the way he did when he was choosing not to argue. He set the wrench on the porch rail. He looked out at the field, at the rows of stumps still waiting. "Reading tells you what the wood is," he said. "Otis will tell you what it wants." Different thing. He walked back to his truck. He did not push her. She would come to understand over the next several years that Harlan Whitfield's refusal to push was itself the most persuasive thing about him, a kind of patience that reminded her uncomfortably of the way her father had once let her figure things out on her own by simply declining to intervene. She drove out to Otis Kettering's place 4 days later on a Saturday in a light rain that turned the last mile of dirt road into a slick of red clay. She had the photograph of the ruined oak in her jacket pocket. She had rehearsed what she was going to say and abandoned 3 different versions of it by the time she pulled up in front of a house that was smaller than she expected, painted a faded barn red, with a workshop out back easily twice the size of the house itself. Otis Kettering opened the door before she knocked. He was 72 years old, though she would not learn that for another year. His hair was white at the temples, iron gray on top. He wore a canvas apron over a wool shirt, and there were curled shavings of some pale wood caught in the fabric of both. He looked at her, then past her at her truck, then back at her. "You're on the Bracken place," he said. It was not a question. Nora had not introduced herself. "Word travels," she said. "Harlan travels," he corrected. Same effect. She held out the photograph. Otis took it in one hand. He looked at it for a long time. He did not invite her inside. The rain fell on the brim of his cap and dripped off in a steady line onto the porch boards. "You cut this wet," he said. It was not a question either. "I didn't know." He handed the photograph back. He looked at her hands, still wrapped in bandages that had gone gray around the edges from work. "Wood isn't ruined because it's old," he said. "It's ruined when people stop imagining." She waited for him to say more. He did not. He looked past her again at the truck, at the road, at the rain. Then his eyes came back to her, and something in them shifted just slightly, the way a hinge shifts before a door decides which way it will open. "Bracken," he said more quietly. He said it as if he were testing the sound of it. "You Thomas's girl." Something in Nora's chest went very still. "Yes." Otis Kettering looked at her for a long moment. She could not read his face. It was not warmth exactly, not sadness exactly. It was the expression of a man who had just heard a name he had been carrying around for a long time and had not expected to say out loud today. "You favor him around the mouth," he finally said. "Go home. Let those stumps rest a full season. Don't touch the walnut at all until next winter. Come back when the ground freezes." He turned and closed the door before she could ask him what he meant, or how he had known her father, or why the sound of a dead man's name in his mouth had made his voice drop half an octave. She stood on the porch in the rain for another full minute. She walked back to the truck. She drove home very slowly. She did what he told her. She hated doing what he told her. but she did it. The winter that followed was the longest of her life. She built a lean-to along the south side of the barn from lumber. She pulled off a collapsing section of the loft floor. She dragged tarps over the stumps she had ribboned, as promising the ones with visible spalting or figure. She measured moisture content twice a week and wrote the numbers down in the hardcover notebook next to her father's readings from years earlier. And slowly, without meaning to, she began to see a pattern in her father's notes. She had missed the first 6 times through. He had been tracking not just the drying of the stumps, but the specific microclimate of the field, which parts held moisture longer, which corner near the creek stayed damp into July, which ridge caught the drying winds off the ridgeline and cured wood twice as fast. He had been reading the land the way she was learning to read the wood. Otis appeared at her fence line for the first time in early December. She had not seen him since the visit in the rain. She was out cutting brush from around the stumps in the north row when she looked up and saw his truck at the end of her driveway and Otis leaning against the front fender with his hands in his pockets watching her without waving. She did not walk over. She had a feeling she was not supposed to. He stayed maybe 10 minutes. He watched her clear a patch around a cherry stump she had ribboned red. When she looked up again, he was walking back to his truck. Before he got in, he called across the field without raising his voice much. The cherry wants to keep one crack. Score the north face 3 inches down when the temperature drops below 20. It will split there instead of everywhere. He got in the truck and drove away. She did what he said. In January, when a cold snap dropped the overnight low to 14, the cherry stump split along a single clean line exactly where she had scored it, running north-south 3 inches deep. Opening a crack, she could close her fist inside. The rest of the stump held. She stood in the field the morning she saw it, and she almost laughed, though there was nobody to laugh with. Otis came back twice more that winter. Each time he stayed longer at the fence, and each time he offered one sentence before he left. Let the sap tell you when to work it. When it stops running, it is ready to be listened to. And the epoxy is a tool, not a cure. If you fill every crack, you have made furniture out of a stump. If you leave the right cracks, you have made a stump into furniture. There is a difference, and it will decide whether you sell 1 piece or 100. She wrote down every sentence. Richard came back in March. She was in the barn when she heard the vehicle. She thought it might be Otis, though Otis had never once driven past the gate. She wiped her hands on a rag and walked out. The SUV was gone. In its place was an older sedan, a domestic thing about 8 years past its trade-in date, with a dent in the passenger door that Nora recognized because Richard had gotten it backing out of a client's driveway 6 years ago and had been meaning to have it fixed ever since. He got out. He was thinner than the last time. His shirt was not one of the ones she remembered, and it did not fit him well. He raised a hand. He did not smile. The buyer's still interested, he said. Higher number now, 15% above what we talked about in the fall. Nora leaned against the barn door. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it in the sense that she had rehearsed being calm, though her calm was more brittle than she wanted it to be. You look tired, Richard. I've had a rough quarter. He tried the smile now. It did not reach his eyes. Nora, listen. This is a good offer. Better than anything you'll get from anyone local. Take it, and move somewhere you don't have to work like this. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. She looked at his hands. They were shaking very slightly at his sides. His shoes were the good shoes he had always worn, but they were scuffed at the toes in a way she had never seen him permit. She thought about the conversation she had had with Marion 6 weeks earlier, when Marion had called to say that the parent company of the logging outfit had filed a securities disclosure listing 3 pending land acquisitions in the state, and that Richard's brokerage arrangement had shown up as an item on their books, because he had foolishly taken a modest advance payment against a deal that had not closed. He had spent the advance. The company had begun asking politely at first, and then less politely when the transaction would be completed. Richard's own sales numbers Marion had been able to see through public filings had been declining for 6 consecutive quarters. Nora looked at Richard now standing in her driveway in shoes he could no longer afford to replace, and she felt something she had not expected. Not pity exactly, not vindication. She felt the strange dislocation of realizing that a person she had spent 19 years of her life with had been sinking for at least 3 of those years without her noticing because she had been sinking too and had not known to look for a face beside her going under. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about the 4 months. Richard, she said, When did you sign the letter of intent with the broker? He blinked, his mouth open-closed. What? The letter of intent with your Rotary friend. When did you sign it? The color drained out of his face in stages starting at his forehead. She watched it happen. It was not a satisfaction exactly. It was more like watching weather. 4 months before the divorce was final. You knew what was on this land. You structured the settlement to leave me holding it. You were going to buy it back through a shell for 80 cents on the dollar and flip it to the same company that was dumping stumps on it. And now you need the sale to close because you spent an advance you weren't supposed to touch until close. And if it doesn't close, I don't know exactly what happens to you, but I know it isn't good. He stared at her. He looked for the first time in the entire marriage like a person she did not recognize. He looked like a man watching a door close on the other side of a room he could no longer cross. How did you get off my land, Richard? He tried for a moment to say something else. His mouth worked. Nothing came out. He got back in the sedan. He backed slowly out the driveway. She stood there until his taillights disappeared past the ridge. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the porch until nearly 3 in the morning with her father's notebook on her lap and a cup of tea gone cold, watching the moon move across the sky above the field. She was not angry, which surprised her. She was tired. She was aware that a man who had once shared her bed was now facing the collapse of a life he had built partly out of what he had planned to take from her. And she felt for him what she thought her father might have felt in the same circumstance, which was a very quiet kind of grief for what a person becomes when they cannot admit what they have become. Her first sale came in April, and it was almost an accident. She had finished her first planter that spring. She had used the small oak stump Otis had told her to leave alone through the winter, and she had shaped it slowly over the course of 6 weekends, using techniques she had cobbled together from the library books, her father's notes, and the 4 or 5 sentences she had banked from Otis. She had filled 2 cracks with clear epoxy, letting the grain shine through the amber, the way Otis had described treating the flaws as lines of character instead of failures. She had sanded the whole piece by hand because her palm sander had died in February, and she could not yet justify replacing it. She had sealed it with an exterior finish she had bought based on a recommendation from a woodworker in a forum she had joined online. She set it under the lean-to to cure. 3 days later, a woman named Iris Hanley drove past on her way to Harlan's place, saw the planter through the open barn door and stopped. She was in her late 60s, a retired school teacher, and she was on her way to buy vegetable seedlings from Harlan's daughter-in-law. She walked up to the barn without asking. She stood in the doorway and looked at the planter for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora. That's not for sale, she guessed, because she had learned that people who make things sometimes cannot bear to part with the first ones. I don't know, Nora said honestly. I hadn't thought about selling it. I'll give you $40 for it right now. Nora said yes before she had done any of the math. $40 would not cover the epoxy, the sealer, the gas she had burned running the saw. It would cover roughly half a tank of propane. She loaded the planter into Iris Hanley's trunk and watched the woman drive away, and she stood in the driveway holding 2 $20 bills, and she felt for the first time since she had signed the divorce papers like a person who had a job. Iris Hanley put the planter on her front porch 3 miles down the county road. She filled it with lavender. Within a week, 7 other people had asked her where it came from. Iris, who had been a school teacher for 34 years and knew how to answer a question without being asked twice, wrote Nora's phone number on the back of an old grocery receipt and left copies on the counter of the diner, the feed store, and the post office. The old flip phone Nora had been using since she left the subdivision started ringing. The technique came together over that summer, piece by piece. She learned to fill the deep natural cracks with clear epoxy instead of wood putty, so the grain still showed through instead of being hidden. She learned which sealers held up through a real Appalachian winter, and which ones failed by spring, mostly by watching what happened to the pieces she left out as tests. She learned to use an angle grinder to smooth rough chainsaw texture into something a customer would actually want to run their hand across, and she learned through one memorably scorched attempt with a wood-burning tool how heat could be used to darken and define grain lines instead of simply blackening the surface. She learned, too, that preservation wasn't a single step, but an ongoing relationship with the wood, that even a properly sealed stump needed its finish checked and refreshed every couple of seasons if it was going to survive a real winter outdoors. She learned that rustic furniture done right was less about roughness for its own sake, more about leaving the wood's own history visible instead of sanding it away. She began to price her work in a way that reflected the hours and the material. Small planters went for 80, then 120. A garden bench she carved from a maple stump the following August sold to a couple from 3 counties over for $450, and the woman who bought it cried a little when she saw it, which Nora did not fully understand until later. The bench that changed her thinking arrived through a phone call from a widow named Cordelia Marchetti, 2 towns north. Cordelia's husband, Vincenzo, had died the previous winter after a long illness. He had spent the last 4 decades tending a single corner of their small backyard, a raised bed of tomatoes and herbs he had built the summer they moved in, adding a stone here and a trellis there until the corner had become something between a garden and a shrine. Cordelia wanted a bench there. She wanted it made from oak. She wanted it to look, she said on the phone, groping for the word like it had already lived somewhere. Nora took the commission. She spent 5 weeks on it. She used a stump she had watched all winter, a piece that had a slow split running down one side that she scored carefully to guide, and she filled the resulting crack with epoxy tinted a shade darker than the wood itself, so the line looked less like damage and more like the record of a decision. The day she delivered it, Cordelia Marchetti walked out to the corner of the garden in a house dress and slippers, 91 degrees in the shade of the maple over the driveway. She was small. Her hands were spotted with the marks of a long life. She looked at the bench for a long time before she touched it. She ran a fingertip along the epoxied crack, following it from one end to the other. Then she sat down. Then she put both hands flat on the surface of the seat and closed her eyes. "It looks like something that has already lived a life," she said quietly without opening her eyes. "The same as he did." Nora did not answer. She could not immediately. Cordelia opened her eyes. She looked up at Nora, and there was a clarity in her expression that stopped Nora's breath for a second. A look that said, "I have understood what you have made, and I have paid a fair price for it, and this transaction is finished between us in every way that money can finish it. But there is another thing that I would like you to carry with you when you drive home. People do not buy furniture, dear," Cordelia said. "They buy proof." Nora drove home the long way. She pulled off twice on the shoulder because she could not see the road well through her eyes. She sat in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. She wrote the sentence down in the notebook that night exactly the way Cordelia had said it, and she looked at it for a long time before she closed the cover. Otis came to the fence line the following week and stayed longer than he ever had. He watched her work through a whole afternoon while she roughed out the first chair she had ever attempted using a stump she had been saving since December for something she could not yet name. He did not offer advice. He did not speak at all until she shut the saw off around 4 in the afternoon and walked over to the fence to wipe sawdust off her face. "You'll do," he said. That was all. He walked back to his truck. He drove away. She stood at the fence line for a full minute afterward, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not settled since her father died. A small and very quiet permission from someone she barely knew to become a person she was already becoming. The next hire came looking for her in September. His name was Cody Freeman. He was 22 years old. He drove up in a pickup truck with a bad muffler and a bumper sticker for a community college he had attended for 1.5 semesters before dropping out. He got out and stood in the driveway with his hands stuffed in the front pockets of a canvas jacket. He looked at the field. He looked at the workshop she had begun expanding off the barn. He looked at her. "You hiring, ma'am." She was not technically. She had considered it. Orders were coming in faster than she could fill them, and she had turned down 2 commissions in the past month because she could not physically make them in the time the customers wanted. "Depends," she said. "What can you do?" "Not much yet," he said honestly. "Willing to learn. Worked one summer felling timber with my uncle before the work dried up. I know what a chainsaw is at least." He glanced at his boots when he said it. Something in the way he glanced made her look at him more carefully. He was not tall, but he was built the way men in this county tended to be built, thick through the shoulders from work he had probably started too young. His face was open. He had the kind of eyes that had trouble hiding anything. "Which uncle?" she asked. He hesitated. The hesitation told her everything before he said the name. "Buck. Buck Halloran. Runs a crew for the outfit that used to bring stumps to this field." He said it looking at the ground. He said it the way a person says something they have been carrying around for a while and have decided to put down. "He drove for them," he said, "on the crew that brought loads here. He didn't know at first that it wasn't right. When he found out, he stayed on because he had 2 kids and no other job. He never told me any of that. I found out from my aunt at Christmas. I've been trying to figure out what to do about it since. Nora studied him. You don't owe me anything, she finally said. Your uncle doesn't work for me. I never met him. I know that. I'm not here because I owe you. I'm here because I want to learn something, and this is where the wood is. She thought about it for the length of a slow breath. She thought about Cordelia Marchetti's line about proof. She thought about her father's notebook. She thought about her own hands, which by now had calluses in places she had not known could form calluses. Start Monday, she said. 7 a.m. Steel toe boots. I'll teach you what I know. Some of it I'll teach you wrong the first time because I'm still learning some of it wrong. Fair. Fair. He walked back to his truck. Before he got in, he turned around. Ma'am, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Ask me again after your first week. He almost smiled. He got in the truck. He drove away with the bad muffler complaining all the way up the ridge. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, a different truck came down the driveway. It was a company pickup white with a small green logo painted on the door. The driver was a broad man in his 50s with a graying mustache and a jaw that had been set for a long time in the particular clench of a man expecting bad news. He got out. He walked toward her with his cap in his hand, which she registered as significant. Ma'am, my name is Buck Halloran. I run the crew for Ridgeline Timber. I understand my nephew came out here looking for work. He did. He starts Monday. Buck nodded slowly. He looked past her at the field. His jaw worked. I owe you a conversation, ma'am. I've owed it to somebody for a long time. Might as well be you. Nora tilted her head. Say your piece. Buck Halloran looked at the ground, then back up at her. Cody must have told you. He did. I'm not going to make excuses. I did what I did. I could tell you I didn't know the first year. I could tell you I couldn't afford to lose the job the year after that. Both would be true, and neither would matter. What I can do is offer you something now, if you'll take it. She waited. We've got stumps every week. We're paying to have them hauled to a landfill 60 miles from here because the state's watching us now. That's costing us money. If you'll have them, I can bring them here sorted. By species. Cut cleaner if you tell me how you want them cut, and the company will pay you a use fee for the land. I've already cleared it with them. They know they don't have another good option. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Behind him over his shoulder, she could see her field. She could see the walnut stump she had not touched since the day she had knelt beside it in the moonlight. She could see the rows of ribboned stumps she had been cataloging for almost a year and a half. How much of a use fee, she said. He named a figure. It was more than she made in a month right now. He watched her face while he said it the way people watch the face of someone who has power over them and is deciding in that moment how to use it. Sorted by species, she said. Cleaner cuts per my specifications. Payment monthly in advance. Deliveries on Thursdays only before 9 a.m. I want a signed agreement. My lawyer will draw it up. He nodded. Every one of those. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a second before he took it. His grip was steady. His eyes did not leave hers. Ma'am, he said quietly before he let go, I don't expect you to think well of me, but I hope someday you might not think as badly. She did not answer that. She just let go of his hand. She watched him walk back to his truck and drive away. She stood in the driveway for a long time afterward. That night, 40 miles away, in a small rented apartment above a hardware store, in a town where he had recently moved because he could no longer afford the house, in the subdivision, Richard Bracken received a telephone call from a broker who had been calling him every 3 days for the past month. The broker's voice was polite in the way that voices become polite when they are delivering information that is no longer negotiable. He said that Ridgeline Timber had informed him this afternoon that they were no longer pursuing acquisition of the Bracken parcel. They had reached an operational arrangement with the current owner that met their disposal needs. The letter of intent Richard had signed was as a consequence void. The advance he had received was per Section 4 of that letter immediately due and payable. Richard sat down on the edge of a bed in a room he had rented month to month, and he stared at the wall in front of him, and he did not speak for a long time. Outside on the street below his window, a Thursday night was becoming a Friday morning without asking him for anything. On the porch of a farmhouse 60 miles away, Nora Bracken sat with her father's notebook open on her lap. The pages had grown soft under her fingers over the past 18 months. Beside her sat her own notebook, thicker now, its cover scuffed pale along the spine from being carried in and out of the barn every day. She had written a new line at the top of a fresh page that evening in the careful, slightly slanted hand she had inherited without ever being taught. Buck Halloran deliveries begin Thursday next, sorted by species. Cody starts Monday. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the field, moonlit, now the stumps casting shadows longer than they were tall. She thought about what she had almost done a year ago, which was to give this land back to the people who had used it as a garbage bin. She thought about what she had almost become in the process, which was somebody who let a man like Richard reach into her life a second time. She thought about how close it had all been, and about how none of it had been closer than a single decision she had made alone at a lawyer's desk when she had asked a question no one else in the room had thought to ask. Somewhere out past the ridge, a coyote started up one long note and another answered from farther off. The wind was warm for the season. She could smell the field as she had smelled it that first morning, wet oak and old cherry, though the diesel undertone was mostly gone now. She stayed on the porch until the moon slid behind the far edge of the tree line, and when she finally stood up, she felt older than she had that morning in a way that did not tire her. The stumps were not going anywhere. She was not going anywhere. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of those facts felt like a sentence. They felt, both of them, like the beginning of a much longer word she had only started to learn to spell. The third year began with a snowstorm in February that trapped Cody Freeman at the farmhouse for 2 nights. He slept on the couch under a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, ate through most of a pot of chili Nora had made for a week's worth of dinners, and by the second morning had learned more from watching her sketch a chair frame at the kitchen table than he had learned in his first 4 months on the job. When the plows finally reached the county road, he drove home with a sketch tucked in his jacket pocket, and within a week he had built the frame himself from a red oak stump he had helped haul out of the north row. And Nora looked at it in the workshop light and understood without saying so that she had crossed a line she could not walk back. She was no longer a woman working alone. She was a woman running something. She hired Marcy Petrie in April. Marcy was 31, a former veterinary technician from 2 towns over, whose clinic had closed after the retirement of its only vet, and she had spent the previous winter helping her brother restore a stone farmhouse, which was where she had discovered that she preferred working with her hands to almost anything else she had done for money in her life. She came out for an interview with paint under her fingernails and a firmness in her jaw that Nora recognized immediately as the look of a woman who had decided something. Nora hired her before the interview was over. Marcy took to finishing work the way Cody had taken to structure, and within 2 months the shop had begun producing 2 pieces a week where it had once produced 1. The third hire came in June. His name was Elmore Vance, and he was 68 years old, which was younger than Otis and older than everyone else on the property by a comfortable margin. He had been a high school shop teacher for 34 years in a district 3 counties south, and he had retired because his wife had wanted to travel, and then his wife had died unexpectedly in her sleep 6 weeks before the retirement papers went through. He drove up one afternoon in a truck that was cleaner than any vehicle Nora had seen at her place in a year, walked to the workshop with his hat in his hand, and asked if she needed somebody who knew how to teach the young ones the parts of a table saw without losing a finger. She thought for a moment. She said, "I don't need a table saw operator. I need somebody who knows how to slow this place down when it wants to move too fast. Can you do that?" Elmore looked around the workshop. He looked at the piece Cody was rough shaping on the far bench. He looked at Marcy, who was hand sanding a bowl by the window. He looked back at Nora and said, "Ma'am, I have been slowing rooms full of teenagers down for 3.5 decades. I believe I can manage 3 grown adults and yourself." He started the following Monday. He brought his own coffee thermos, refused to let anyone else refill it. And by the end of his first week, he had reorganized the tool wall in the workshop in a way that made every task in the shop take 4 minutes less than it had the week before. Cody, who had been running the saws with a certain young man's carelessness that Nora had been quietly worrying about, began wearing his hearing protection without being reminded. Marcy, who worked alone and liked it that way, discovered that she liked working alone slightly less when the person humming quietly at the next bench was Elmore Vance, who knew when not to speak. The workshop by the end of that summer no longer felt like a barn with a lean-to attached. It felt like a small, deliberate business. Nora raised her prices. She did it without apology because Elmore had sat down with her one Saturday morning and walked her through the numbers on a legal pad, and the numbers had shown her something she had been avoiding for a year, which was that she was paying herself less per hour than she was paying Cody and Marcy, and that this was not sustainability. It was a slow form of self-erasure that women in this county had been practicing for 4 generations. And Elmore, who had watched his own mother do it, would not permit her to do it under his roof, even if the roof happened to be hers. The orders that followed the price change did not slow down. They increased. Nora would later say that this was the moment she understood all the way down what Cordelia Marchetti had been telling her the summer before. People had not been paying for the wood. They had been paying for the fact that somebody had believed something was worth saving. When she raised the price, she was not raising the value of the object. She was raising the value of the belief. A landscape architect named Roland Weatherby called in August. He had a project 3 counties over a small residential subdivision built around a shared green space, and he wanted everything in the common area to come from her shop. Benches, planters, a low signage arch at the entrance, carved from a walnut stump he had heard about. He offered her a number that made her sit down on the porch steps after she hung up. She called Elmore, then Marcy, then Cody in that order. She told them what they had just been offered. She told them she would take it only if the 3 of them were willing to work 6 days a week through the fall to deliver on time. Nobody hesitated. They started the following Monday. The subdivision project ran from September through the middle of December. Roland Weatherby came out to the property 4 times during those months, each time with a young associate carrying a portfolio and a camera. On the 3rd visit, he asked with the particular deference of a man who was not quite sure who he was speaking to anymore, whether Nora would mind if his firm photographed the workshop in the field for a case study they were assembling for a design conference in the spring. She said yes without much thought. She would later count that yes as the 3rd or 4th most important decision of her life, though at the time it felt like a small courtesy. The photographs, when they appeared in a trade quarterly the following March, showed the field of stumps in early morning fog, the workshop with its neat tool wall, a close-up of the arch Nora had carved with an inlay of tinted epoxy running through the grain like a seam of dark water. The caption read, simply, reclaimed, reimagined. Within a week, Nora's phone stopped ringing with individual customers and started ringing with wholesale buyers, hotel design consultants, a boutique resort on a lake in the northern part of the state that wanted a full set of outdoor furnishings for its cabins. She hired a 4th person in April of that year. His name was Silas Hooper. He was Cody's cousin. He was quiet in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of Otis. He turned out to be the best finisher any of them had ever seen. The workshop moved out of the barn that summer. Nora had a proper building put up on the concrete pad where the lean-to had stood 24 feet by 40, with a real dust collection system, a stove for winter, and windows that faced west, so the afternoon light fell across the benches the way she had always imagined it might. On the day the building was inspected and signed off by the county, she stood in the empty interior alone before the crew moved in, and she thought about her father, who had never once in his life owned a shop of any kind, though he had drawn plans for one on the back of a paper mill pay stub she had found tucked into the last page of his notebook the previous winter. She did not cry. She had learned over the past 4 years that crying was something she did on her own time, not on the property, not in front of anyone. But she stood there for a long time. The SUV came down the driveway in the fall of that year. It was not the SUV Richard had once driven. It was an older model, mid-90s, by the shape of the taillights, the paint sun-faded across the hood. It slowed at the gate the way a vehicle slows when the driver is not sure of the reception he will receive. Nora was in the field with a tape measure and a notepad, which was where she still was most mornings before 7, no matter how many people worked for her. She looked up. She recognized the vehicle only by the way the driver's door opened hesitantly and by the shoulders of the man who stepped out. Richard. He was a decade older than the last time she had seen him. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair was mostly white now at the sides, and the barn coat he wore was one she did not recognize. Canvas so worn at the elbows, it had gone soft. He carried a small wooden box in front of him, with both hands the way a person carries something that has taken them a long time to decide to bring. He stopped 10 feet short of her. He did not try to smile. He did not raise a hand. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. "I know how this looks. I promise you I'm not here to ask for anything." Nora set the notepad down on the nearest stump. She waited. He held out the box. It was walnut. She recognized the grain before she recognized what it was. It was the box her father had kept his chisels in, the one she had found in the cabinet 4 years earlier. Or rather, it was the outer box her father had made for a smaller set of chisels that had matched a matched set that had gone missing sometime around his funeral. She had noticed at the time. She had assumed they were lost, or that a cousin had taken them at the wake, or that her father had given them away years earlier without telling anybody. "I took these," Richard said. His voice was steady, which surprised her. "The week of the funeral, I was helping your sister move things out of the house. I saw them in the hall closet. I told myself I was taking them so you wouldn't have to deal with them. I told myself I would give them to you when you were ready." He looked at the box. "I never gave them to you. I don't have a good reason. I think at first I thought you were too fragile to look at them. That's what I told myself. Then I stopped telling myself anything. Then I forgot I had them. Then this spring I moved out of the apartment I'd been in for 2 years, and I found the box in a storage unit I'd been paying for and had stopped opening. I saw the wood. I remembered." He held them out farther. "They belong here. I don't know why I couldn't give them to you before. I don't know why I could take them in the first place. I've thought about it a lot. I've thought about a lot of things I did during those years that I don't have good explanations for. This is one of the smaller ones, but it's one I can undo, and I would like to undo it while I still can." Nora did not take the box immediately. She looked at his face. She looked at his hands, which had liver spots on them now that she did not remember from before, and were shaking very slightly. Not from fear, from age, from whatever 4 years of something like this had done to him. "Why now?" she said. "I was diagnosed with something in June," he said. "Nothing dramatic, nothing quick, but something that has made me start to look at the things I still own and ask which ones I actually earned." She did not ask him what the diagnosis was. She did not need to. She took the box. It was heavier than she remembered. She opened it. The chisels lay in their velvet slots exactly as her father had kept them. The handles darkened with the oil from his palms. The blades touched with the faintest bloom of surface rust that a person who knew what she was looking at would take as evidence that the tools had been stored well and left alone rather than neglected. "I'm not going to thank you," she said quietly. "I know. I'm not going to forgive you. Not for this. Not for the other things. I know. I want you to leave now, Richard. I want you to leave, and I want you to know that this is the last time we will speak. And I want you to know that whatever comes next for you, it is not because I wished it on you. It just is." He nodded. He did not try to say anything else. He turned around. He walked back to the SUV. He opened the driver's door with the same care he had used on the way in. He drove out. Nora stood in the field with the box of chisels in her arms for a long time. She did not cry. She did not go inside. When Cody came out to ask her a question about the piece he was starting that morning, he took one look at her face and turned around and went back to the shop without a word. She carried the chisels down to the workshop later that afternoon. She cleaned each one at her bench, oiled the blades, worked the tiny rust off with a piece of fine steel wool that Elmore had left on her side of the wall. She set them in the top drawer of the toolbox she kept beside her workstation. She did not use them that day. She did not use them for 6 months. When she finally did use them, it was on the piece that would eventually stand at the entrance of a public park 2 counties north, and the first cut she made with the smallest of them, on a piece of white oak the color of morning light, felt like the closing of a door she had not known was still open. Otis came down with something in his lungs in the last week of November. It was Harlan who came to tell her. He drove up on a Saturday morning, got out slower than he usually did, stood at the edge of the workshop door with his cap in his hand. She saw him before he said a word. She wiped her hands on a rag and walked over. "He's over at the county hospital," Harlan said. "It's not the emergency room kind of thing, not yet. He'd rather be home. His nephew came in from Roanoke and set up a bed in the front room. He asked after you." She drove out that afternoon. The rain had come and gone the way November rain does in that part of the state, leaving the roads slick and the fields dark. She stopped at the market on the way for a jar of the honey Otis had once told her in passing was the only kind he drank in tea. She was surprised standing at the counter paying that she had remembered. The nephew met her at the door. He was a slim man in his 40s with the tired look of a person who had driven a long way on short notice. He led her back through a house she had never been inside, past a kitchen with dishes still drying on a rack, into a room where Otis lay in a hospital bed set up against the far wall. He was smaller than she remembered. She realized seeing him that she had never seen him sit down. He had always been standing at a fence or leaning against a truck or working at a bench she was watching from a distance. Now he was propped against 3 pillows, and his hands, which she had once watched score a stump with a control that seemed to belong to a younger man's body, lay still on the blanket in front of him. He smiled when he saw her. It was a small smile. It reached his eyes. "You brought the honey." "I did. Set it on the dresser. My nephew will steep me a cup after you go. He talks less than you do when he pours." She laughed. She could not remember the last time Otis had made her laugh. She pulled up the chair his nephew had left by the bed and she sat down. They talked about small things at first. The weather, Cody's progress on a piece Otis had heard about from Harlan, the new shop. Otis wanted to know how the west windows had worked out. He asked after the light. She told him it fell exactly the way she had hoped it would, that Marcy did all her fine sanding on the west bench in the last hour of the day, because the light picked up ridges the ceiling lights missed. He nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not sadness, it was the look of a person who had decided that a thing needed to be said now, because there might not be a later. "I owe you a story," he said. She waited. "I knew your father," he said. "I told you that the day you came out to my place with the picture of the oak. I said it and I meant to say more. I've been meaning to say more for 4 years. I'm going to say it now while I've still got the wind for it." The nephew in the kitchen turned on a faucet, then turned it off as if he had realized his uncle was speaking and did not want the sound to interfere. The house went quiet. "Your father came to a woodworking demonstration I gave at the county fair in the summer of 1991, Otis said. "You would have been small. He came with a friend who was interested. He wasn't interested in the friend's way. He was interested in the way a person is interested when they've been thinking about something quietly for years and did not know there was anybody else who thought about it. He asked me after the demonstration whether I ever took on students. I told him I didn't, but that I could show him a few things privately if he wanted. He came out to my workshop 3 times over the following year. He was a natural. His hands knew things before his head did. I told him so. I told him he could do this for a living if he wanted, that there was a way to make it work, that I knew people at the state park system who were always looking for carvers. He came out one more time in the fall of '92. He told me he'd thought about it. He told me he couldn't. He had a mortgage. He had 2 daughters, one still in high school, one about to be. He had a wife whose family had already lost one farm to a set of dreams that hadn't quite worked out, and he was not going to be the second man in her life to do that to her. He said all of this without complaint. He shook my hand. He thanked me. He did not come back." Otis paused. He looked out the window at the gray afternoon. "I did not see your father again for 18 years, he said. I saw him one more time after that. Late winter, 11 years ago, 3 weeks before he died, though I did not know it at the time, and neither I think did he. I was at a farm supply on the north end of town, buying a length of chain, and he was there buying feed for a chicken coop he was building for a great-grandchild. He saw me, he came over. We stood in the parking lot for maybe 20 minutes. He asked about my work, I asked about his. He told me he had a daughter who was going through a rough patch in a marriage he did not think was going to last, though he did not want to say more than that. He said, and I remember this because it stopped me at the time, that he had been watching the trucks dump stumps on the back 40 of his place for the better part of a decade, and that he had come to think over that time that the stumps might be the most valuable thing on the property, that he had thought about doing something with them himself, but that his back was not what it had been, and that he could not have started something like that in his 60s and finished it in his lifetime. He said he had made his peace with that. He said what he had not made his peace with was the thought that he might die without ever having told someone that the stumps were worth something. He asked me right there in the parking lot whether I would keep an eye on the place after he was gone. Not the place exactly, the daughter, if she ever came back. Otis looked at Nora then. His eyes were clear. His hands lay still on the blanket in front of him. He said, if my Nora ever comes back to that land, would you look in on her? Not push her toward anything. Just be somewhere she can find. He said she is going to figure something out over there someday, and I would like it if there was somebody standing at the fence who knew what she was looking at. Nora did not move. She did not breathe for a long moment. I told him I would, Otis said. He shook my hand again. He drove off. He was dead 3 weeks later, and I did not know it until I read it in the county paper. I have been standing at your fence for 11 years, Nora. I did not know when you were coming. I did not know if you were coming. But he asked, and I said yes. Nora put her face in her hands. I would have told you sooner, Otis said quietly. I did not know how. I did not want you to work through those first stumps because a dead man had asked me to look after you. I wanted you to work through them because you had decided to. I waited until you had decided. I thought that was the right thing. I hope it was. She lifted her face. Her eyes were wet. It was, she said. It was the right thing. He nodded. His hand moved on the blanket. She reached out. She took it. He was a good man, your father, Otis said. He was a good man who did not do the thing he most wanted to do because he thought other people needed him to do something else. There is more than one way to spend a life. His was one of them. Yours is another. Neither one is wasted. Neither one is a mistake. I want you to know that I told him I would look in on you, and I did. And that whatever you build from here forward, you are not building it because he could not. You are building it because you can. Those are different things. Do you understand? She nodded. She could not speak. He closed his eyes. He held her hand for a while longer. The light outside was going the way November light goes silver into slate into nothing. When she left an hour later, he was asleep. His nephew walked her to the door. He thanked her for the honey. She thanked him for staying. They understood each other without either of them saying more. Otis Kettering died 3 weeks later in his sleep in the same bed where she had held his hand. Nora carved his marker herself. She used the walnut stump she had been saving since the very first winter, the one Otis had told her not to touch until she was ready, and she had never quite been ready, though she had understood without acknowledging it that she was saving it for something like this. She worked on the marker for 2 weeks alone in the evenings after everyone else had gone home. She made it low and long, more like a bench than a headstone, because Otis had once said in passing that he did not care much for the vertical honesty of a proper marker, that a stone standing straight up looked like it was trying too hard to be noticed. She carved his name into the top face. She carved beneath it the years. She did not add anything else. Otis had not been a man who wanted anything else added. She placed the marker at the corner of her property where the fence met the tree line at the exact spot where he had stood on the day she had cleared brush around the cherry stump he had told her to score. She placed it facing the field so that whoever sat on it, if anyone ever did, would see what he had seen. The following spring, a public park 2 counties north commissioned a full trailhead installation. Benches, planters, a low welcome arch at the head of the main path. Nora and the crew delivered it in early June. On the day of the ribbon cutting, the parks director gave a short speech in which he mentioned without naming her a woman who had built a business out of what a logging company had thrown away, and the small crowd applauded, and Nora stood at the back of the crowd with Harlan Whitfield next to her. And Harlan, who had come along because she had asked him to, did not say anything. He only nodded once slowly the way he had nodded on the day he had returned her father's socket wrench, as if some quiet transaction that had been open for a long time had finally been closed to his satisfaction. The 7th year brought a piece in the Regional Home and Garden magazine, and with it a waiting list for custom commissions that stretched past 6 months and a wholesale relationship with 2 garden centers in the state that took everything the shop could produce in a given quarter. Nora crossed into 6 figures in annual revenue that year without mentioning it to anybody in town. Elmore Vance was the only person on the property who knew the exact number, and Elmore Vance did not mention numbers to anyone unless he was asked, which nobody thought to do. The Thursday morning trucks still came. They came at 7 as they always had, though the drivers now got out of the cabs and walked over to the workshop and knocked on the frame of the open door before unloading anything. Buck Halloran came with them most weeks. He and Nora had settled into something that was not quite friendship and was more than a working relationship, a kind of low mutual respect that had grown out of the fact that neither one of them had ever pretended in the years since the first agreement that the arrangement had started clean. He brought her coffee. She let him tell her about his grandkids. Cody, his nephew, had become the shop's lead structural carver, and Buck did not talk about that with her either. But she knew he was proud of it in the particular way that a man of his generation was proud of a thing he did not have the words for. We used to think we were throwing away trash, Buck said to her one Thursday morning in October of the 7th year, standing at the tailgate of his truck with his hands in his coat pockets. Now we know we were carrying somebody's inventory to them. Nora smiled. She did not answer. She did not need to. She still walked out into the field most evenings, tape measure in one hand, notebook in the other. The notebook was on its 4th volume now. The first one, the hardcover she had bought in town 4 years earlier, sat on the shelf above her desk in the new office next to her father's soft-covered original. She kept them there where she could see them. She did not open them often. She did not need to. She still knelt beside the newest stumps. She still ran her palm across the rings. She still wrote something down, moved to the next one, did the same thing. Whoever had watched her from the driveway on that very first Thursday morning would not have been able to tell at a distance that anything had changed in the 4 years since. Up close, everything had. Sometimes in the last hour of the light, she thought about the house with the wraparound porch, the boat the leased SUVs traded every 3 years, the mahogany conference table where 20 years had been divided into columns by two lawyers who did not know either of them well. She did not miss any of it. It had never been building toward anything this field had. It had been building toward a version of a life that a woman was expected to want, a version that could be sold back to somebody else the moment the woman stopped performing it, which was in the end what had happened, and which she had come to understand was a mercy, though it had not felt like one at the time. She thought about her father sometimes. She thought about him more often now than she had in the 20 years before the divorce. She thought about the parking lot conversation Otis had described, and about the sentence her father had said to a man he barely knew in the last weeks of his life, which was in effect that a woman he loved was going to find her way to something someday, and that he wanted to make sure there was somebody standing where she could see him when she got there. She thought about the fact that he had known this without knowing when, and that he had spent the last decade of his life measuring stumps he did not own on the chance that his daughter might one day want to know what they were. She thought about the way most people spent their lives trying to clear away the things that blocked their path. She thought about how a few of them quietly, and without ever meaning to, discovered that what had looked like the obstacle had been the raw material for everything they were built to make. Nora Bracken did not find success by escaping what had been left behind on her father's land. She found it by staying, by kneeling down in a field everyone else had written off, by picking up a tape measure instead of a telephone to call a lawyer, and by refusing piece by piece, stump by stump, to stop imagining what something old could still become. Down at the corner of the property on a low walnut bench facing west into the field, the marker she had carved for Otis caught the last of the evening light. Beyond it, past the tree line, the ridge went dark, first the sky staying pale above it for another quarter hour. The workshop lights were still on. Cody was closing up. Marcy had gone home. Elmore was locking the small office he had built for himself in the corner nearest the door. Silas was already gone. It was Thursday. It was almost 6. Tomorrow was Friday, and Friday was a delivery day, and after that would be Saturday, and after Saturday the whole thing would begin again, the way it had begun every week for years now, the way it would keep beginning for years yet. Nora stood in the field with her notebook closed at her side. She looked out at the stumps, at the shadows they threw at the ones she still had not touched, at the ones she was still saving for something she did not yet have the shape of. The wind was cool. It smelled of the field oak and cherry dry. Now no diesel left in it anywhere. Somewhere out past the ridge an owl called once and did not call again. She walked back to the house. She turned off the porch light behind her. She went inside. The trucks would come on Thursday as they always did. And Nora Bracken, who had once stood at a broken gate on a foggy morning and looked at a field of ruin and seen instead the beginning of the only life she had ever fully chosen, would be waiting for them, tape measure in hand, notebook open, ready to write down what had been brought.